Take two of this presentation class because the first one didn't save, so I'm really hoping that this one does. Welcome, I'm Mr. McNiven, and this is my presentation on organizational structure while I'm away in Calgary. So this is the first part of three, and today you're going to be with Mr. Costello, and I hope that you're looking forward to this class. And so we're going to talk briefly for hopefully close to 15-20 minutes in this video, and there's going to be some questions associated with it, and then you'll have a short activity to do. So please behave in my absence. I'm watching. Okay, so what do we need to do in the course of these exercises? Well, in this chapter, which hopefully you've already read a little bit on the chapter as it was on TigerNet, you need to know some important terms about organizational structures, and we're going to go over those today. You also need to analyze and apply different types of organizational charts, changes in organizational structures, and you need to evaluate how cultural differences and innovation can impact that communication. You're also going to need to draw an organizational chart, and we're going to draw one today as a little homework assignment. But today, really, we're focusing on the know and the draw, maybe a little bit of the analyze and apply, but not so much. So the first thing is, well, what is an organizational structure? And then hopefully you have been, you read and you understand what it is. I know we drew one on the board the other day, just rough, but what is it? And really, it's an internal formal framework of a business that shows the way in which management is organized and linked together, and how authority is passed through the organization. So you want to think about the types of words that are kind of bolded here. It's internal, meaning it's not really shown to the outside. It is a formal framework, which means it formally sets up or officially sets up who is speaking to who and who's communicating, who's responsible for. It's also very organized and it delineates who is speaking to whom, and it's linked to show authority, who's in charge of who else. So that's kind of what an organizational structure is. And these can take lots of different forms. We're going to talk about some of the more traditional forms today and see how they operate. So the traditional hierarchical structure looks like this. You've got often what would be a president at the top. You've got the VPs below that, and we've got some people even below that. And this clearly already delineates that the president is in charge, followed by kind of the under subordinates and the regular workers. Now, this is a very simple business company organizational chart that can take lots of different forms. But really, what a chart like this does is it does a couple things. It shows who has responsibility for decision making. That's one thing it shows. What formal relationships between people and departments exist. How accountability and authority are passed down. The number of subordinates, formal channels of communication, and the identity of managers. These are all things that would be shown on here, and most companies would have this. Sometimes they won't write it down, but they probably informally know. Now, Ridley doesn't have, actually I've seen a couple of them written down, but they're brief ones, and that's going to be the activity today that you're going to draw one out. So what are the key principles of this organizational structure? Well, there's rules in which we have to make them, and there's ways in which they are designed. And there's three principles that I want you to be aware of. The first is a level of hierarchy. And the level of hierarchy is a stage of the organizational structure at which the personnel on it have equal status and authority. So if we go back to our example, we know that the VPs all have equal status and authority as it appears in this organizational chart. It doesn't really matter how many people are under here. They would have basically the same type of authority. So that's the level of hierarchy. The chain of command is the second term, and this is the route through which authority is passed down. So the chain of command in this example is the president comes up with a thought, they disseminate this information down to the people below, who then tell the people below. And so that's kind of how a chain of command works. The last kind of way that we can understand these organizational charts are the span of control. And that's the number of subordinate reporting directly to the manager. So again, if we look at our organization, we know that the VP of sales has 2 subordinates, VP of production has 3, and the VP of marketing has 2. And this creates different situations. Certainly, the VP of production has more people to try to meet with, more responsibility, whereas the president themselves has 3, and how that might complicate things. So we need to think about the span in addition to the chain. So I want to continue on from there to discuss 2 types of formal organizations, and that is the tall versus the flat structure. Now, the tall structure is like the one on the top, and that means that there's usually 1 or 2 people at the top who have subordinates, or the chain of command is basically a limited number of people. The span is very few, so we see that the president at the top of this has 2, they each have 2, they each have 2, and goes down. If we look at the flat organization, we have one person at the top who's in responsibility for 3, who then has a responsibility for 4, who has a responsibility for 6. So that greatly changes the types of interactions you're going to have with your workers, the amount of money that's being spent on each management position, the amount of time that it takes to communicate. So we can kind of think, I want you to think in your head, the types of effects that a tall versus a flat would have on those departments. Now, we're talking about this kind of formal, rigid way of communicating. Really, the word for it is bureaucracy. You may have heard the bureaucratic term in politics, and basically that means that if I wanted to communicate something at the government level, if I, Mr. McNiven, wanted to make a law, well, I'd have to go to my local representative, who then would have to go to a larger representative, who would then have to present it in the House of Commons, who would then have to go through a lot of red tape and discussions, and that's really what bureaucracy is. It's a formal way of doing things. We have that in business too. Bureaucracy is an organizational system with standardized procedures and rules, and we'll have that as delineated or structured by this organizational chart. It's a system of administration distinguished by its clear hierarchy of authority, rigid division of labor, written and inflexible rules, regulations, and procedures, and impersonal relationships, which is kind of like a side effect of this whole process. And once instituted, bureaucracies are very difficult to dislodge or change. And sometimes they can be viewed in a negative sense, like this image. We have often what we see the manager at the top, and he's pooping, so to speak, on the other employees. And I like this image for a couple of reasons, is that everyone kind of below doesn't really like what's going on, especially the people at the bottom. They kind of have it the worst. And it's still not a pretty picture for the people in the middle. Often we assume that middle managers have it great. But because you're in such a rigid hierarchy, it may not end up being that great. So the advantages of bureaucracy, well, in a situation like this, the roles are clearly defined. People are going to do very defined jobs. The chain of command is clear, who you speak to and who you don't. There's an emphasis on a role, and we talked about role culture the other day. And there's a division. The division does not have to be based on functional departments. We could have lots of different people at the same kind of level. But there's also a lot of disadvantages. Communication is mostly top-down. Mostly in those structures, it's very difficult for people to communicate back up the chain. And there's a lack of horizontal communication. Because those lines don't exist, we don't think about formally communicating with each other. There's also resistance to change. People might not be very happy about the type of change that's happening. The next kind of issue involved with organizational structures is this issue of delegation and accountability. Let's go back up to the bird situation. Let's say that the manager at the top wants to allow for the executives to make their own decision. Well, what is that? That is delegation. And delegation is defined as passing authority down the organizational hierarchy. We want to make sure that we can allow for people to make decisions so that we don't have to micromanage everything from the top. And the accountability piece, well, accountability is defined as the obligation of an individual to account for their own actions and to disclose results in a transparent way. So if we do delegate, we're giving them the opportunity to be responsible for that, but we're also making sure that they do it in return. So, and to be transparent about it. And the advantage of when a manager would do this, well, we often would say that it gives management more time. It's going to free you up from doing other things. It shows trust in subordinates, develops staff. They'll actually reach the point of self-actualization on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's a little bit of a prelude to the next couple lessons. We're going to talk about Maslow's. And it encourages accountability. We want to make sure, imagine that your teacher, if I said, you know what, class, don't just stop this video. Learn it on your own. I think that would be a good thing. People would be like, Mr. McNiven, trust me to learn it. But would you? And I think that's kind of always the battle, is that the management doesn't necessarily want to relinquish all the control. And the disadvantages of doing this delegation thing, well, there needs to be proper training and proper definition. I need to train my workers on how to be able to act on their own. Power needs to be fully granted, not partial, and certainly not retaken. And managers often, the problem is that managers often delegate boring jobs. We think about the king who's still painting the lines on the road. You do have to delegate some authority to your workers, and that's a tough thing, especially in a rigid structure. So, we move on to delayering. Well, how could we adjust our bureaucracy to be less bureaucratic? How can it be less cumbersome for people to communicate? And one of these strategies is delayering. And delayering is defined as the removal of one or more of the levels of hierarchy from an organizational structure. If we look at this image, for example, we have this is a pyramid style chart, and we can view our organization like this. It's much the same as the other one that I was showing you, and we've actually taken a layer right out. This supervisor layer has gone. Now, what happens to that supervisor layer? Well, there's a lot of implications. Certainly, if we were to analyze the act of delayering and taking a whole element of management out of our system, well, the advantage is that it reduces costs. We don't have to pay those people anymore. And it certainly shortens the chain of command. So if we want to communicate to our employees or have them communicate to us, it's very quickly. It increases the span of control, so people have more control, more responsibility. That might work into the favor of some managers. And it increases motivation because the lower workers are now closer to the higher superiors. They're not some distant idea. But there's also some bad sides, and if we were going to analyze this, we want to say that, well, there's going to be payouts for redundant workers. We're going to lay a bunch of people off. We just let a bunch of people go. So what are the implications of that? We also have to increase the workload on existing managers. The jobs still have to be done. You can't just take a job out. So those have to be passed above and down the existing layer. And there's also a sense of security that's low. Well, if the management can get rid of somebody, they can get rid of me too. So we don't want to stress our workers out with that. The last topic in this kind of mini lesson is about centralization and decentralization. Well, what is centralization? Well, centralization is the keeping of all the important decisions within the center of the organization. And decentralization, well, the decision-making powers are passed down to subordinates. So if we think of centralization, I'm going to add this in just that it's okay. Centralization, the advantages are that, well, there's rapid decision making. If one person is making a decision, think of it like a monarchy or a dictatorship, well, yep, we're just going to make it. There's no real talking about it, so it can be made really, really quickly. And those policies are probably consistent because it's one person making the decisions. The decisions are often, in theory, made in the interest of all departments because that person at the top sees all the departments and isn't really part of any of the departments, so it's made in the interest of the best. There's also economies of scale, and there's experienced people making decisions. That management's probably been up there for a while. But we also want to think about the other side of that, the advantages of the decentralized decision making. Well, local decisions are going to reflect local conditions. If we allow people to make their own decisions in those functional departments, well, then they're making good decisions for them, which might be actually better. Junior managers can develop their skills. There's a delegation and empowerment have strong influences on motivation, and local changes can be responded to quickly. Let's say there's a problem in sales and that has to go all the way up to the top. Maybe that person's away at another department. It's going to take some time to respond to that. And sometimes in business, we need to respond very, very quickly. So that's kind of the lesson for today. What I would like you to do is to design, whoa, that's a spelling error, hold on. Design what you think would be Ridley's organizational chart and consider how each of the main topics discussed today applies to your chart. So that's kind of going back and saying, okay, how does level of hierarchy apply to my chart? How does the chain of command, the span of control, how do those play? Is it tall or is it flat? What do you think Ridley's is like? How does bureaucracy play a role in my chart? What could be evidence of that? I also want to think about how delegation is dealt with. And not just delegation, but also accountability. What happens in that job? How could we possibly delayer at Ridley? What jobs do you think could be eliminated or amalgamated? And also, are we centralized or are we decentralized? What's your experience of this place? So that's what I'd like you to do, is design and draw what you think to be Ridley's organizational chart. Consider how each of the main topics discussed today applies to your chart. And develop 2 questions for your classmates that challenge your understanding of your own chart. And those should be related to the content that we talked about today. So good luck, behave, and there's going to be some associated readings and some questions in addition to this material. So thanks for paying attention, and greetings from Calgary.